if we don't want to go back to a dark age where everything like really goes down very fast and a lot of people dying, we need to mutualize in, smart mutualization, smart localization. And again, that's where Web3 comes in. They have the technology to do that. They just need to go down at the level of physical reality, like, renewable energy, organic farming. That's where they should be.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. This is a show about regenerative finance. We are exploring pathways to a life-affirming economy. I'm your host, Matthew Monahan, and today it's my pleasure to be joined by Michel Bauwens. Michel is the founder of P2P Foundation. Welcome, Michel.
Hello, Matthew. Happy to be here.
Yeah, and for those who aren't familiar with your body of work, maybe a bit of background and context.
Well, just maybe on a personal level, I'm from Belgium. 20 years ago, in my 40s, I moved to Chiang Mai. So I've been living there for 20 years now. And I'm the founder of the P2P Foundation, which is an observatory of all things peer-to-peer and commons-based. And what I mean with peer-to-peer is the new capacity that we have through digital networks for trans-local self-organization. And I believe this is really new in the history of humanity. So we could do convivial things at a small scale, but as soon as we wanted to scale, we needed to build, civilizations, armies, hierarchies, bureaucracies, which set a real limit on our conviviality, and I think now we can actually recreate that at a higher level, right? I often refer to Kojin Karatani, he's a Japanese author that I really love. And so he kind of says, and let me briefly explain it. So mode A is hunter-gathering, kinship-based, which is essentially commoning and gifting as value exchange. Then you have what he calls mode B is the state, the temples that regulate the rice in Mesopotamia. Then C is the market. And he says, but humanity always tries to recreate mode A at a high level of complexity. And he calls that mode D. Because kind of we're wired for this. We're wired for hundreds of thousands of years. We've been nomadic, live with small bands. And so civilization is in a way very alienating. You're a slave, you're a domestic, you have to die, for your country or for the empire. And so there's always this hunger in humanity to go back in a way, but at a higher level of complexity. And this has been tried by world religions, right? Who are always first proletarian revolutions in a way that challenge the empire, like the Christians were first slaves. Then it gets kind of slowly co-opted and it creates the basis for a new form of civilization. I think when we abandoned religion, it became like these mass secular movements that are messianic. So Marxism, fascism, but I would say even liberalism, the great mass ideologies of the industrial age. And now I think it's more, like Web3 and urban commons and bioregional movements, but always kind of that kind of drive to get back to a more humane, more harmonious lifestyle with nature and with other human beings, eventually, non-human beings. And so it's back on the agenda. Every time the civilization goes into a negative spin, the hunger for this different way of life comes back. And I think we are in the middle of this.
Beautifully framed. And, you've been an independent researcher, thinker, voice in the commons space for a long time, but interesting to see you here at a crypto conference.
Right.
You were just over in Chiang Mai at a lot of the pop-up villages. You gave a great talk at Funding the Commons the other day. Kind of somewhat the elder in the room,
Right.
giving some structure and some wisdom about the Web3 space. And it was extremely well received. I've heard several positive remarks as well.
Yeah.
So why are you here? What's catching your attention about Web3 and what's your journey with these technologies
So
been?
what I think Web3 is doing historically is creating a global mutual coordination infrastructure. So I see the first phase being free software, open design, shared knowledge, Wikipedia, Linux, Arduino. That was like the first phase, which creates the capacity to globally coordinate labor, right? You have an open ecosystem, you have a common goal, and people can freely uh, associate their passionate skills, I would say, to this common project, and then hopefully create an economy and around it. And that's very significant because if you look at the history of labor, right, civilizations are basically slave based societies first, and they disdain labor, right? Then we have like the Christian Revolution, after the fall of Roman Empire, where for the first time, there's a large movement saying "Ora et labora," work and pray, right? And so transforming the world through your labor becomes like a high aspiration. And if you think about the early monastics, they're farming, they're doing crafts, they're intellectuals, they're praying, all in one community, an integrated community where the body and matter and nature is actually equally revered. But then in the 16th century, we take that away. Labor becomes a commodity. It's emptied of its significance, and we all have to sell our labor in order to survive. But that doesn't make us happy because only I think in the West one out of five people feel they're satisfied, in the meaning of their work, right? And the web brings that back. It creates an open signaling system where everybody can say, "Oh, I can do that. I want to do that," and so they're passionate from the beginning. It's meaningful from the beginning. And well, so what if we can create a world like that, right? Using this capacity to actually reorganize our societies around passionate work. So that's kind of, I think, the dream. So then the second phase, that's more properly crypto and Web3, is we succeeded in financing that labor because there was a problem with free software is you could finance the work if you were interfacing with the market.
Right.
It was very difficult to finance the core collective work that made these systems work, right? And so that gave them the room for big multinational companies to enter the space and start heavily influencing it, like IBM with Linux, these kind of things, right? And so crypto innovated like crowdsourcing finance. So, yeah, you can have VC, you can have banks, but you can also have a million small investors that could go around that, right? And then you create like alignment strategies to, you consider capital as a contribution, the coding as a contribution, everything else can be a contribution, and then you create like voting systems which are essentially anti-oligarchic, like quadratic voting. So basically, one share, one vote. That's your first vote, but then to have a second vote, you need the how do you call it? The square root. Anyway, so the next I think is 4, and then 16, and so you basically cream off the power of money and give it to the contributors, to the people collaborating on the project. So there's many things I like about Web3, and maybe just anecdotally, the advantage of the commons in a period of polarization and fragmentation is that people love their common object that they're constructing.
Right.
The commons, which is like a transcendental social object in a way, it goes beyond the individual, and that aligns them, and then they can put their politics between brackets, right? So what really got me was I was in Montenegro about a year and a half ago. It's called Zuzalu, the first pop-up village. And I was sitting with a climate denier, a, a collapsist, a deep adaptationist, and an impact investor. Can say a greenwasher if you want to be mean about it. But anyway, but they were talking peacefully and respectfully. And I thought, wow, this is more than what I thought. This is not just money. This is, there's community there, there's common aspirations. So what's missing, and that's what I try to work on, right, is because at the same time we have this kind of exponential growth of millions of people doing regenerative local work, but they're underfunded, they're undercapitalized. Usually it's like two people getting half a wage from an NGO, and they work 16 hours a day, and after 5 years they totally burn out. So how can we fund that, right? And I think that Web3 can be the vehicle for capital to be invested in regeneration, right? And so what I imagine is, let's say, a coalition of community land trusts, right? So they're all local, doing their work locally, but they also have a global commons. And that global commons has all the common protocols of cooperation, the common knowledge, the common patterns, but also it's a vehicle to attract capital that can go local, right?
Mm-hmm.
And can I say something about regulation? It's kind of a history of regulation, the way I see it.
Mm.
So once we have empire, we have a system that still has commons, like shared resources managed locally by local communities, and empires keep the market in their place, right? The mandarins are ruling, not the markets, right? And then you have in Mesopotamia clean slate legislation and the Jubilee. So usury is kept in check and all that kind of thing. Once we have capitalism, we lose that. The commons are enclosed. They're radically eradicated in many ways. Um, and then the state becomes a vehicle for regulating the market, the nation state, right? And that works until I would say the 1980s.
Mm.
And so within capitalism, you have something what we call the lib-lab tension. So 30 years of high growth, good for labor. You have reforms, welfare, but then capital is not making enough money, so they revolt, and then you get deregulation, right? Reagan, Thatcher in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
You can trace that back at least 6 cycles. This the same kind of switching of regulatory dominance, right?
Yep.
But what happened in 1980s is paradoxically, because the left fails, so we have cybersyn in Chile, which is the first attempt at cybernetic and democratic coordination of the economy, under Allende with Stafford Beer, the complexity theorist, and it fails. But that's when the Chicago boys basically used this experience to create the global neoliberal supply chains, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that creates transfinancial capital. So now we cannot regulate market anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why everybody's so frustrated with politics, because it doesn't matter whether you vote left or right.
Mm-hmm.
The power is not there. The power is in the power of capital to move around and to basically punish you if you do anything that goes against their interest. And so there's 2 possibilities to react to that. One is inflating the state again. That would mean a world government. And that's probably a bad idea. I mean, people are already against the EU because they feel it's too controlling. And imagine a world government. How far is that from the people? How far from the local culture, right? And what do they know about the local culture? So this kind of problematic solution. Although some people are thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so the alternative would be to inflate the commons again, right? To use the commons as the new regulatory mechanism, but that would mean not local commons but translocal commons, right? Um, so what I imagine, I call this the magistery of the commons. You have a coalition of, let's say, permaculture, a particular way of doing respectful agriculture. Locally they're weak. It's just a bunch of people, but globally, what if there are 12,000 of them? And what if they have a common social power, like common property that can help the nodes individually, I think that would create the premises and the seeds for a new type of institution that can operate at the translocal level. And that's what I call cosmo-localism, right? So cosmo-localism means basically everything that's heavy is local, everything that's light is global and shared. So you combine relocalized production, which doesn't have to be primitive back to the land. It can be like distributed manufacturing, very technically advanced with common designs that are global,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's an example, I think it's called Arrival. It's not open source, but it's still interesting as an example. They can make vans and buses at a local level. They have like a platform, all the designs, and if municipalities want a few buses, they'll just make them. And they can be everywhere in the world with the same set of designs, but they can, of course, adapt it locally.
Mm-hmm.
Um, So that's kind of like relocalizing, right?
Mhm.
With biodegradable, circular designs and all of that. And this is like thermodynamically interesting, matter energy wise, because we spend 2 times, or I could be wrong, could be 3 times as much on transporting than on making nowadays, right? And that's really problematic.
Mhm.
And so localizing means a huge lighter load of
Mhm.
humanity on nature. Then on top of that, we can mutualize locally, right? Meaning creating more commons. So a shared car association, every shared car replaces 9 to 13 private cars
Mm.
for the same amount of travel freedom, point to point. So you don't lose any freedom like you would in public transport. It's just like a neighborhood shares, a dozen cars. 95% of the cars, are in the garage at any time. So if you have 10%, you have double what you need to ensure
Mm.
full capacity. Imagine we do that, at scale everywhere, right? Every provisioning system, we relocalize it, we mutualize it to a certain degree again. Like if we do that, we can maintain a very high level of complexity in our societies. Everything we love about modernity, despite all the things that we hate about it. But I think like living until 70 is probably better than dying at 30. All these kinds of advantages that we have today.
Mhm.
Like if we don't want to go back to a dark age where everything like really goes down very fast and a lot of people dying, we need to mutualize in smart mutualization, smart localization. And again, that's where Web3 comes in. They have the technology to do that. They just need to go down at the level of physical reality, like renewable energy, organic farming. That's where they should be. That's where they should be doing. Because to be honest, multinationals don't need global supply chain. They already have them,
Mhm.
right? So what can Web3 do about that?
Mhm.
That's not really an advantage. But if they can connect with these local projects, and I think that's what you want too. I think, right?
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah, totally.
yeah,
Okay, so what I hear you saying is that you have this kind of pendulum swinging between state power and market power, and right now we're in a world where the market is kind of the animating
right.
force, and what we want to get to is not, I mean, maybe some want to get to it, but what you're suggesting is maybe what we're not after is one world government. What we're
Yeah.
after is kind of a reinflation of the commons
Yes. Global
and
commons.
global commons, and that there is this kind of pattern of cosmo-localism or translocalism that allows for shared commons
Yeah.
resourcing at a global level, but also that if it's heavy, it drops down to the local level. Means of production and food and material economy kind of relocalizes,
Right.
and that way we can kind of try to get the best of both worlds. The modernity that
Yeah.
we've grown
And
accustomed to.
yeah, another way to say it, we have to try to be fully differentialist, like reinstate cultural difference at a local level.
Mm.
Also, domain specific freedoms, in food and transport, and at the same time, we have to remain universalist, right? And that's another problem with localism is that if it's
Mhm.
not universalist,
Mhm.
there's no planetary care, which is already a problem with the state. The state has no responsibility
Yep.
for the world ecology, only for its own people.
Yep.
And bioregionalism is interesting, right? Because so the state is not directly connected to any thermodynamic equilibrium.
Mm.
It's a historical and cultural entity, and I respect that. It's grown through history,
Mhm.
but I think we need a bioregional reorganization, and we can use the technology that we have for thermodynamically informed supply chains, right?
Mhm.
So a way to look at it is we have a ground level of what we call stigmergy, the capacity to coordinate globally and locally by seeing what's happening in open ecosystems that are fully transparent. So that's not a that's we invented this 15 years ago. It's like standard for open source and
Mhm.
crypto, right? Second level, cryptocurrencies, right? Why was Bitcoin interesting despite some of its flaws? Is that it's the first socially sovereign, globally scalable currency, right? That
Mhm.
is socially sovereign, that people trust it.
Mm.
It's not a state nor a corporation. And out of that came the blockchain, and that's a universal ledger. That's hugely important because you look at the history of accounting, the temple, you know, regulating the rice coming in and out, that's the state.
Mhm.
Then 14th century double entry book accounting, that's capitalism. But it's like you're only seeing your own profit and your own capital. There's no impact. You can't see it. Universal ledger, everybody's in 3D now, right? And you can, so you add regenerative, thermodynamically informed cryptocurrencies like Fishcoin. You know how much fish you can fish,
Mhm.
or Solar Coin created with through renewable energy, right?
Mhm.
And then the third level, that's where I see the global commons coming in, is and where AI is going to be very useful, is keeping track of global commodities, global reserves, making sure we don't go under negative pivots. So this is something called global thresholds and allocations. And this will, of course, politically very difficult to do, but will require agreements between states and maybe beyond states.
Mhm.
Because you want China and the US to go to war for lithium? I don't think that's a good idea, right? So that's, I think, will create a basis. I mean, either we go to war first, and that's usually how big reforms happen. But this time, with nuclear weapons and stuff, it's so counterintuitive to destroy yourself to win a
Mhm.
war
Mhm.
that I think we have a good chance to create these agreements that can create these global commons organizations that can then regulate and protect the global flows of matter and energy and protect human and non-human communities.
Mhm.
Uh, but this all requires what I said and what you said about
Mhm.
the inflation of the commons. Regrowing the commons at a cosmo-local level.
Mhm. So I want to ask you how you see that messy transition between where we are. Like, how can we wrestle that energy from the market forces into the commons? But before I go there, you've said a lot of nice things about Web3, but I know even when I saw you on stage a couple days ago, you also have your fair share of critiques or reminders to the
Right.
Web3 space of some of its shadow side. So just so that we're kind of a bit balanced, what are you seeing that Web3 is maybe not on track around, or maybe just some of the critiques?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, I think Web3 is mainly an exit strategy for privileged layers of society. So, first of all, people within capital who see the system is not doing well, and they want to do arbitrage between nation states. So, if
Mm.
Portugal collapses, you go to Greece. If the Philippines collapse, you go to Thailand, and that kind of thing, right?
Mhm.
And then they democratized it to, let's say, the global coding class, right? Which is about 34 million digital nomads right now, and maybe 10 million with the crypto wallet. Um, but again, they're not rooted, right?
Mm.
They're rootless, and they should be rootful. Um, so I still see a role for digital nomads. And so there's an author called Austin Wade Smith. I think you had him
Mhm.
interviewed. I watched it quite some time ago. But his idea is to combine bioregional guilds, right, of
Mhm.
people rooted in the local, like permaculture workers and community land trust activists, and
Mm.
so they're
Mhm.
doing it locally. They're connected with their global commons, and within that, you have a group of people traveling around, sharing the knowledge, knowing the collective protocols, knowing the technology. But that's of course not what we have today. Today we have people moving around, looking for the nice weather, and so I'm not idealizing it, but they're still building these global coordination mechanisms, and that's a good thing that they're doing, right?
Mhm.
So it should be applied to something good instead just for like kind of escapist strategy. And even for themselves is going to be like necessary, because if things get really bad and you're seen as a parasitical force, they'll come after you, right? And
Mhm.
that's one of the reasons I admire your own work with creating eco villages, because you're rooted in a local community. They won't come after you. you know, you see these billionaires building, 20 levels under, buying mountains, and with reason they're afraid of, like, are these guards not going to turn against me? Yeah, they probably will, because that's how it happened in the past, right?
Mm-hmm.
The barbarians who threw over Rome, the gods were actually the legions of Rome,
Mm-hmm.
right? They couldn't control them anymore. And so it makes a lot of sense to have this different strategy of being rooted in the real physical world, and have digital nomads being as kind of like a guild of
Mm-hmm.
knowledge workers, right? That seed their knowledge, the specialized knowledge, because localism is necessary and good, but it's also not necessarily very innovative. Most people at the local level just kind of keep repeating stuff. So it's good to have people coming in from the outside and
Yeah.
innovating. Um, so you also asked me about the transition.
Before you go there,
Yeah.
can
Okay.
I ask you about right now the largest cryptocurrency is Bitcoin? Strong libertarian ideology and political philosophy that underpins it. Yeah, can you say more about a world in which Bitcoin becomes a reserve asset of some significance, like digital gold? Pros and cons to that kind of world.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you have money, so if you're either rich or global middle class, then Bitcoin is kind of like virtual gold. It's a global reserve currency, and I think that has its uses. Uh, it may not be fair for everyone, but it's obviously useful for some.
Mm.
I think it's also very useful for activists, right? I mean, like, think about Julian Assange, even on the right, Nigel Farage. When he discovered that he was cut out of the banking system, like 10,000 people wrote to him, say, "Yeah, it happened to me too."
Mm.
I mean, that's amazing that banks are now filtering people based on their opinions. And Canada with the truckers. So this is very dark, and so the fact that we have this reserve
Mm-hmm.
currency that's kind of half dark, that can move around money and capital for people in need, I think that's really good. And then the blockchain, right? Universal ledger is a real revolution that is connected to the Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
So those are like the strengths and the limits. But beyond the Bitcoin is like programmable cryptocurrencies, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you talked to Arthur Brock of Holochain, right?
We haven't had him on
Current
the show yet, but yeah, I know our
currencies, right?
yeah, yeah,
Seeing
yeah,
seeing the currents.
totally.
And the current money system is not thermodynamically informed. It's totally uprooted from real physical realities. So if you can bind money,
Mm-hmm.
right, to externalities and seeing it digitally, that can be a real important advance. So what I
Mm.
see is that people will have something like context-based sustainability, which is, by the way, all these things already exist experimentally. I so there's a project in South Korea. Mark Whitaker was doing this. So 850 bioregions, 130 commodities. You mix that, and it goes straight to the smartphone of individual people, so they can see, like, what am I spending, and am I above the average or below the average of regenerating or degenerating
Mm.
the environment that I'm part of, right?
Mm-hmm.
I also really like Region Network, and I'm sure you talked about them, right? The
Mm-hmm.
planetary ledger,
Mm-hmm.
ecological states, so a set of like 30 metrics that tell you everything you do, is it improving or degrading the environment? So basically, that's what we need to do, because capitalism is efficient, but it's not resilient.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of like pushed all externalities out of the way to keep things cheap. But by doing that, we have exhausted our natural environment, right?
Yeah.
And the next civilization has to solve that. Um, has to have I think, broaden the social contract to the whole world. So the welfare state, I think, is a great invention.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we should completely abolish that. It's
Mm-hmm.
you know it's good that people have pensions and health insurance and all of that, right? So, but it was very unequal because many people in the third global south now didn't have it. So we need a global social contract, and we need a new natural contract, right? A contract with non-human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is all possible now, right? and new forms of multilateralism. That's what I call the global magisterial of the commons.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the solutions are there in seed form, prefiguratively.
Yeah.
But the big question, and I don't claim to have the answer, that is like, which social force is going to actually make that happen?
Yeah.
And that's where our political crisis is so dysfunctional for that, right? It's like
Totally.
identitarian left, reactionary right, like they're not gonna do it. So, but there's nothing else. So
Yeah.
I think for the time being, it's people, commoners doing it at a local level, connecting internationally. It's it's not going to political system that's going to change in the short run.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, just on that thread of like context, with money, it's interesting to me. We haven't seen that many experiments that I'm aware of in the crypto space around it, but if I hand $1 to a taxi driver and that taxi driver hands the dollar to, the hot dog stand, and then they pay their rent, and like the dollar has a history of how it moves,
Right.
and who those relationships are, and with digital currencies, that information is now easily, programmable, contextual, and now all of a sudden you can start to create meta-analysis of impact, of values, of identity.
That's what Will Ruddock is doing with Sarafu Network in Kenya.
Right, yeah.
I think that's such an exemplary project, right? You have these savings and loans associations, usually women, and they put 10, 20 euro a month or a week in a common pot. And then normally one of them would get it every month or every week. And so I could be wrong about the details, but about 1,000 of these circles give some money to a common pot that creates a collateral that allows a mutual credit currency to be created with a multiplication effect. Like you can create more currency than you have in your collateral, right? Fractional reserve system, basically.
Yeah.
And then he added the blockchain to it, so it becomes visible. And now any NGO who wants to work against poverty knows that it gives $1 million, it becomes $6 million. They can see it. They can see where the money is going. So that's a really tremendously, I think, positive use of combining blockchain, with a real life integrated, currency in poor neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Grassroots economics, for people who are interested in going deeper on that. We have Will's co-founder, I believe her name's Jambi. In a couple days, we're going to speak with her, and yeah, I'll be meeting her for the first time, but excited to share more. Okay, so I had asked you and alluded to the transition, and you kind of said, well, we don't know exactly which political force might take us there, but do you have kind of visions of how this might look? And because there's so much of a challenge of how do you wrestle back control from the market to bring
that's where
commons?
I'm a bit more pessimistic, because I did 5 years ago, I started really reading systematically what I call the macro historians. And to give a brief overview, so start with Spengler, also Spengler, Decline of the West. And then you have a whole series of cultural macro historians, Jean Gebser, Joseph Campbell, Peter M. Sorokin, Carol Quigley, the more spiritual Aurobindo, Théâtre de Chardin, and they all stress cultural agency, and they look at patterns in history, and very interesting. Then you have a second school, it's called World System Analysis, neo-materialist, neo-Marxist in a way. They look at geopolitics, core periphery, structures in the world, look at the long economic history, anyway. So that's, then the third school is called Big History. Since the 90s, they look at common patterns of change behind the evolution of matter, life, and human culture, right? So if you look at those three, what comes out of it is that you have a relatively stable system in some kind of equilibrium. You have within that a growth period, a peak, and a decline period, and a collapse. So basically, you always need a chaotic transition. And to make that real, let's think about, okay, Europe, you have the mercantilist period, right? The absolutist monarchs, like in France, they favor trade. They're still based mostly on land, production of land. But then Napoleon, right? That's the chaotic transition. I think 15 to 30 million people die. And after his defeat, you get Smithian capitalism, the dominion of capital over labor, no labor rights, no multilateral organizations, just alliances. And that collapses with World War I and World War II. And then we get the welfare state reforms, and that collapsed in 2008. So you can see that these changes are never easy. You really need some kind of disintegration of the old paradigm before the new paradigm can emerge. But what's the positive way to look at it is to look at seed forms. So the way it changes is okay. So you have a crisis, and so you have polarization and fragmentation, right? Um, so the pagans against the Christians, the Reformation against the Catholics, the Confucianists against the Taoists, the culture war today, right? Yeah. So the main narrative disintegrates, so you get fragmentation, and people look who is most like me, and that creates polarization, right? But the new doesn't come from there, right? The new comes from people who leave that system. So the first is the pioneers, the people with anticipatory consciousness, and they say, "Yeah, this is not working. We need to find something." So they leave the system, they experiment, find new ways, and so they create seed forms. Eventually, after many failures, some new models emerge. They can find each other, create a subsystem, and they usually create also new classes of people, like the merchants in European cities. And just to take that example, right? Purgatory. Why is purgatory interesting? Because Christians couldn't lend money. So now, usury is defined as a minor sin. You can buy yourself out through indulgences, and that funds the cathedrals in the cities. And that allows capitalism to emerge in the city states, right? Then the printing press overcomes the limits of the knowledge system of the feudal age. And double entry book accounting creates a new way to manage these firms. So these are seed forms that will create capitalism, right? So that's, I think, where we should focus on. Is like, what are the seed forms, right? And then what happens in the second wave? The more masses of people have to leave the system, which is no longer functioning, and hopefully what they find is already functioning seed forms, like monasteries in the Middle Ages that already exist when they have to leave the cities. So that's the hope, that there are enough, and I think it's Pirogin, a Nobel Prize winning chemist, Belgian, who said, in a sea of chaos, you have islands of coherence, which can have an extraordinary effect, right? So that's, I think, what we're looking for. And Web3 is part of these seed forms, and so are local, urban, and rural commons. So is bioregional finance. So those are all seed forms that we can, I think, with some confidence, see as the prefigurative formations of a new form of civilization. And I stress sometimes post civilization, because civilization was a geographic arrangement, right? When people decided, in order to master nature and not to have to leave because of the drying up of North Africa and the swampification of Mesopotamia, no, we want to stay. And in order to stay, we need to manage irrigation. We need to manage the water. That creates civilization, which is a relation between the rural and the urban, right? The rural needs to produce a surplus to feed a managerial class. But what we're doing now is creating a translocal self-organized, right? So we already talking in Web3 networks about coordinations, network nations, network states, because we actually already want sovereignty, And I came back here in Bangkok from Chiang Mai, where I think we had an extraordinary, pivotal event, which was a confederation of 12 temporary villages. So 12 translocal nomadic tribes congregating, confederating, collaborating, having 20 events per day for a whole month. And Jordan Hall calls this the civium, right? So civilization is place-based, and the civium is not place-based. But you can still learn. So the reason we have cities is because we have an exponential rise of network relationships. And so that creates what he calls a superlinear efficiency of innovation. If we go back to pure localism, we don't have that. People are not, not connected to each other. But if we can have these temporary nomadic villages, then people can still be local, move around to have these very intense periods of collective learning, and then go back to their places, right? And this is what happens. So you imagine people from the whole world converging into one place, learning an enormous amount of things in 1 month, and then going back to their places and enriching their local places with this new knowledge. I really, I kind of enthusiastic because I was there and I thought, wow, this is not trivial what's happened there.
I think the term is you've been green pilled.
Yes.
Yeah, I know what it feels like now to sit on the other side of myself when talking about these topics, because I too get very positive, enthusiastic about Web3, although I'm not as articulate as you, or well read, of course. Yeah, I guess I'm curious, like the shadow of the wealth inequality that could erupt from this, the fact that we had like this narrow 10-year window and everyone got all the Bitcoin and Ethereum.
Right.
And then that group of humans and that particular people with anticipatory consciousness become the new rulers if this thing really works. How do you think about that?
Yeah. So here's where I'm a bit more cynical maybe than the average progressive person. So I have these rules. The number one rule is slaves never win. You look at the history of slave revolts, peasant revolts in the Middle Ages, they don't win. And if they do win, very occasionally, like the Mamluks in Egypt or the Bolsheviks in Russia, they become a new elite. They, they're the same in a way, or even worse. On the other hand, in a complex society based on division of labor and different classes, you can rule without legitimacy. Right. And so I think what that means, if you put those two things together, is change happen through jurisdictional alliances. Alliance of people at the bottom, the middle, and the top. So you look at the Roman Empire, right? The Germanic overlords take over. So the Roman ruling class can no longer make a career in the military. So they shift towards supporting the Christian church. Because in the monastics, their children can be the abbot and the abbess. They can, retire there. They speak Latin. They have their books. So they can actually retain their culture even within the Germanic rule, right? And eventually, a section of these Germanic warlords say, yeah, we need to ally with the Christian church. And that creates feudalism. So it's a new alliance, right? And it's pretty good in a way, even for the common people, because it's a lot better to be a parishioner than to be a slave. You have your family, you have your village, you have your commons, you have your spirituality. I don't want to idealize it, but in a way, it's it was somewhat an improvement in some ways, right? And so I think realistically, we have to look at what could be the jurisdictional alliances that could create this new future. And to be honest, I don't know what it is at this stage. We are still at the stage where the commoners, which I see as an agent, so all the people involved in local and global digital commons, create culture, create community, create social power, and then at some point, who is with us, right? And you can look at Web3 as already that, right? A section of the ruling class investing in a risk, mitigating technology. a section of the coding class seeing it as a way to arbitrage nation states. But of course, the common people are still excluded, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that's, I think, where we need that alliance with urban and rural commons in physical communities producing, survival goods.
Yeah.
As long as that doesn't happen, then Web3 remains this kind of promise, but it's not really doing anything but as an exit strategy for already privileged people.
Yeah. So in that messy transition, which often looks like collapse, but this time we have nuclear weapons, like, have you thought about what could be the mitigating factors? We had a conversation with Nate Higgins recently, and it was, how do we bend, not break, that curve downward, or that decomposition of the current system? And in particular, I'm curious, like, do you see any kind of rise of a peace movement or an anti-war movement that could be one of those uniting coalitions? Because that could also be, directly, emphasizing the counterforce to the worst scenarios here, which would be nuclear war.
I don't see it for the moment. I mean, what I see is, the left used to be the peace movement, and all the left parties are now supporting the war in Ukraine, and I mean, they're amongst the worst warmongers
Mm,
in Europe, for example, where I originally come from.
mm,
So I think the peace movement has basically collapsed. The neocons have moved to the Democrat Party in the U.S., so that's not good news either. I mean, they
mm,
lost, but
mm,
so I think we'll have to reinvent it.
mm,
My only hope is that war is politics by other means. So you do war to win, but I don't see how you can win with nuclear weapons. So in a way, and maybe it's a cynical hope, and maybe it's an illusion, but that they won't do it,
mhm.
right? Because like, who's gonna win if they do it? I mean, it's like self destruction is guaranteed.
Right.
I think it can still happen.
Mm,
Yeah, I wish I knew what to do about this, Matthew. So I think
mm,
that the only thing that we really can do now is just build resilience.
mm,
Seeing the future as this kind of 2 centuries of wild fluxes, one way or the other. Like political swings, conflicts, climate change, floodings. It's not going to be necessarily a very good future for a while. And again, you look at the end of Roman Empire. It took 2 centuries it to fall, right? It almost fell in the third century. Then you have a few good emperors, and they give it another 200 years, and then it falls again.
mhm,
So some people believe, and I'm not sure that's true, that the internet speeds up social learning. I've read articles that say that we're already learning 8 times faster than even 20 years ago. If that is true, that could be a hope, right? Is
mhm,
that if we do find innovations like resilient oriented innovations locally, like, I don't know, a new kind of corn that is good for drought, or can resist storms, and then it can go very fast. That would be one way to look at it, where this kind of common knowledge can be our salvation. It's like, so moving from economies of scale, which is capitalism, so producing more of a thing to make it cheap,
mhm,
to economies of scope, doing more with the same. So basically, using knowledge to spread innovations very fast, right? Cosmo-locally. So if you have a network, any node in the network can create an innovation, and any node in the network can profit immediately from that innovation, because it can really, move very fast. So that's hopefully like a
mm,
accelerating factor. Then demographic collapse will be something to look for. I mean, how is that going to work? I'm not sure. It's totally unprecedented. If I'm not mistaken, by 250, the whole world will go down in depopulation. By 270, we will have lost one-third of the population. But imagine that, like one young person sustaining 8 old people. So it's so unprecedented what we're going through.
yeah.
It's it's a very narrow path between. You probably heard about that scheme, which I really like. So we went from immature biosphere, then we have the great oxygenation event, which was first toxic but created Gaia,
Mm,
Earth system balance. That created an immature technosphere, the humans, that created technosphere that's not in balance with the biosphere. And now we have to go through this very narrow path to create a mature technosphere, right?
mhm,
If we succeed, we can live for millions and millions of years, but not now. We
mhm.
can't. So that's. But
Yeah.
I in the end, I'm optimistic because I don't think we are suicidal species.
Mm,
I think we are ignorant species. We want to ignore the bad news and not see what can happen in the future. But once we see it, we recoil,
mhm.
right? And so every time we had wars, we recoiled, and we created a kind of a high level civilization. Um,
Love getting into the big topics with you, Michelle. Hey, can I add another one? Because you haven't mentioned it. What about AI? How are you making sense of artificial intelligence? And do you have any thoughts on how this factors in?
yeah. So to go back to my scheme, so you have stigmergy first, right?
Mhm,
We coordinate through social signaling. Then we have regenerative market for exchange,
mhm,
and we have this kind of layer that protects resources. That's where I see AI, because it's very complex to manage
mm,
globally the
mm,
limits of 130 commodities and all their possible combinations, right?
right.
And so I think AI can present us with options,
Mm,
and then humanity can decide. I'm still not very hot on AI in general.
mm,
I think it's not as much as people think. I don't think we can eliminate all jobs and all of that. I mean, every time we say the same, and then things are more complicated. We still have bookshops. We still have travel agents. 20 years ago, you read the press; they were going to disappear tomorrow. They're still there.
mm,
So I think AI will be a functional addition to the complexity of human life. Um, m- do you know Berdyaev? Nikolai Berdyaev is a very interesting Orthodox thinker,
mm,
Orthodox Christian thinker. Okay, you have this five-stage idea about technologies. First, we are embedded in nature, right? Then we come out of it and we create mechanistic technology, and we become master of it in phase three. But then in phase four, technology becomes master of us. He wrote this in the 1920s. He was predicting the surveillance state, right?
mm,
And he says, and this will eventually create a spiritual revolt. Where we say, no, we want to stay human. We don't want to be, we don't want to be transhuman. We don't want to be post-human. We want to stay human. We want to be in charge and have a good life, right? So I think now in stage four,
mm,
where we lost control of our own technological children,
mhm,
and they're very immature teenagers. But eventually, I think we'll wake up.
mhm,
We're not there yet, and I think we in the end we have to be optimistic because we need it. Like being pessimistic doesn't work because it actually discourages you to mobilize your energy. And you remember Viktor Frankl, Man in Search of Meaning, where he says only two kinds of people survived in the concentration camps: the Catholics and the communists. The Catholics, because they have a transcendent reality, so they can detach from
mhm,
the suffering and say, there's another place where we can be happy. And then the communists, because they collapse the transcendent dimension into the future and say, in the future we will be happy. So we will win eventually and create a better world.
mhm,
And those were the two groups that had the stamina to survive and actually self-organize within the camps
mhm,
and help each other and have solidarity and all kinds of things which other people couldn't have because everything was dark. They could only see suffering, right? So we need to be optimistic. We need to find the light in the darkness in order to. I think he also said, if you want to fly from A to B, right? then there's the wind shear factor. You have to aim for C. You might not get to C, but you get to B.
Mm-hmm.
And if you only aim for B, you won't get to B.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, of course, that's like a personality trait, right? You have to choose,
Yeah.
and to find the hope always, and mobilize around it, and make
Yeah.
mistakes and fall down and get up again.
Totally. Yeah. I find myself like feeling like I'm too ignorant to know which way it's going to go. So there's no use being too pessimistic or cynical, because
Right.
who am I to know that it will turn out badly? And also, return to the framework of like, well, in so many hundreds of thousands of years, the sun's going to explode anyway. So like,
Right.
don't take any of it too seriously.
Right.
Like,
in the end, in the most cynical answer I can come up with is, I'm gonna die, right? And the only difference is we're all gonna die at the same time. So, same problem.
I think that AI is probably I probably differ from you a bit on that. I think it's gonna be bigger than most appreciate. I don't know about like, oh, it's gonna replace all the jobs. Like I think there's a lot of different ways to think about that, but I do think specifically when we think about the ecological limits and the resource constraints and the resilience conversation, like I think AI definitely algorithmically could help govern the resources and do a better job processing that information, of course. But I also think that it will rapidly accelerate the discovery process of a lot of the synthetic biologies and like if you can have an agent go run 1,000 experiments in the time it took me to go get my lab coat on, right? It's like then all of a sudden we're gonna have this explosion of science happening at the same time.
And instead of one pathogen in Wuhan lab, we'll have 200 in a month.
Well, of course, I think that that's one of the consequences as well, is that we have to really start thinking about, runaway pandemics and, viruses being engineered and so forth. But yeah, I think that the physical reality as we know it, the game has changed, in a way that hasn't yet fully been reflected and manifested. But I think that this, like I have these crazy conversations when we're looking at forestry and native reforestation, and like everyone's talking on 40, 50, 100-year timescales as if timber demand is going to be exactly the same, in the Chinese construction markets in 50 years. And I'm like, I don't know what it's going to be, but it's just going to be different. Whatever is going on from a material perspective. Yeah.
There's a science fiction theme. I stopped reading it maybe 15 years ago, but at that time there was a lot of books that kind of, the thesis is always that every species, intelligent species, reaches this moment in time where they can self-destruct, right? And only those that can go through that become interstellar species. And that's where we are, isn't it? It's we created all the technology that we need to destroy ourselves. And if we don't kind of make a quantum jump spiritually, but if you're familiar, I'm sure you are, with integral thinking, Gene Gebser, Ken Wilber, Aurobindo, I mean, there are jumps in consciousness, definitely. Absolutely, empirically verifiable jumps in consciousness, right? And so there is an interesting author, Peter Sorokin. So he thinks in terms of societal evolution from sensate to ideate. So a sensate civilization only believes in the senses, empiricism, science, right? And it has an arc, emergent, peak, decline, and then it no longer works. And that creates a bifurcation, because the next civilization is then going to be ideate, which is people who reject that. Like the Christian ascetics reject the Roman hedonism. They don't want science. They don't want any of it. They, like Buddhism, original Buddhism, you turn away from the world, right? So this happened many times in history. And it's hard to imagine that as we are today, but that that could very well be the case. If you want to be very cynical about it, think about it this way, right? Liberals don't make kids. only conservative religious communities have children. There you go. There's the replacement already. And they are conservative, but they're likely to be ecological, right? So we don't know what the force is going to be. I mean, you have to keep our eyes open. But I think pragmatically, I like this idea of degradative jurisdiction alliances and regenerative jurisdiction alliances. So, yes, seed forms, but also be political at the same time. Keep looking who's gonna be with us, who's gonna be against us, right? And ally with people who are with us.
Yeah, it reminds me of Helena Norberg-Hodge's framework as well.
Right.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. I feel like any other questions I have are far too quotidian for the lofty nature of this conversation. So, any final words you want to share, Michel? Thanks so much for your time.
No, I don't think so. I think we covered a lot of ground. So, maybe that's trivial, but I think that a big danger today is that people stop reading. And when you watch internet, YouTube, you're reactive. You don't think really. And I think that is really dangerous. So just at a time where we actually need people to go deep, we're creating this kind of presentism. And to be honest, a lot of Web3 is like that too, right? And that's one of the reasons that I'm actually have a certain amount of success, is because there's a hunger for depth. And I will say, the longer you can look in the past, the longer you can look in the future. If you can't look in the past, you're just reacting to whatever comes to you, and it's not going to be very thoughtful and strategic. So I think people should go back to reading, and I think macro history is pretty good. It's interesting. It's really interesting. So I hope to have more people doing what I did 5 years ago and decide to have a consistent reading pattern about things that matter.
Yeah. Michel Bauwens, thanks so much.
Thanks, Matthew.
So you heard the man. Get off the computer and start reading, or to find some great reading materials, just go to wiki.p2pfoundation.net. Michel also has a Substack called Fourth Civilization. We've put links in the show notes. For more great conversations like this one, check out maearth.com. Michel was talking about how do we bring Web3 into the real world and build resilience in local communities. MaEarth just ran its second grants round. You can learn more on the website at maearth.com/grants. We had 30 great projects that were everything from regenerative farms to eco-village experiments to coral reef restoration, reforestation, ecological education programs. Exactly this thesis in many ways is using the Web3 on-chain economy tools, in this case, quadratic funding on Gitcoin, to bring capital into these types of translocal, Cosmo-Local experiments. And we will continue to be building in this arena, as well as sharing more episodes and conversations about these topics. So once again, all of that on maearth.com. Thanks, Michel, for your time, and we'll see you on the next one.